To illustrate that point tonight, I want to go into an Old Testament character that I think, unfortunately, gets a pretty negative shake in our teaching, and this character is Hagar. Hagar gets a bad shake for a couple of reasons. One reason is entirely religious, because Abraham and Sarah are the father and the mother of Isaac, and out of Isaac comes Jacob and Esau, and out of Jacob comes 12 tribes of Israel, and thus the entire story of the nation of Israel, the birthplace of our Messiah, and everything that we see in the Bible kind of revolves around that side of the family tree. And then there's this other side of the family tree where Abraham and Hagar have a little boy named Ishmael. And the reason I say Hagar gets a bad shake is because for most people in the Christian world or the Jewish world, when they think of Ishmael, they think the offspring becomes Muslim, Islam, and therefore Hagar sort of gets pushed out of the collective consciousness of the important figures of the Bible. And when we do things like that, we run the risk of missing pretty important stories because they're in there. I mean, as you're going to find tonight, the entire 16th chapter of Genesis is basically most of Hagar's story. So to ignore her or to go, well, that's the mother of the Muslim religion, so we don't have to pay much attention to that story, really doesn't give her a fair shake. Here's the other reason she doesn't get a fair shake, and we can blame this one on the Apostle Paul. Now, I'm not saying in a negative way we blame it, but put blame where blame is due. Paul uses Hagar as a part of an allegory in the 4th chapter of Galatians to illustrate the law. He says Sarah represents one covenant and Hagar represents another covenant. And then he says Hagar represents that which is of the flesh and corresponds to Jerusalem on the earth, he says, which is a representative of bondage. And he says Sarah represents the promise, and she doesn't correspond with anything on this earth. She corresponds with that which is above. And then Paul stretches the allegory out and says that whoever is born of Hagar is a son of a bondwoman. Servants, slaves, laborers. He says, then whoever's born of Sarah is promised seed, sons. And out of that illustration, Paul has laid out Old Covenant, New Covenant, bondage under the law, freedom under grace, and he builds his whole case off of an allegory, and he interpolates that allegory onto Hagar. Hagar is born a long time before the law, so it's not as if she automatically represents the law, yet Paul puts that on her. Not blaming Paul, he's doing what you're supposed to do with stories, is use them to illustrate points. Dig down in there, turn them over, find out what else they have to say. But because Paul did that, we don't get much out of Hagar. So she's got 2 strikes against her, man. She's got, she's basically at the top of the family tree of another religion, and then here she is in Paul's world as a negative allegory. All right, let's lay those 2 things aside. If it's possible to do, let's try to do it tonight. And let's just act like we don't know where Galatians 4 is going to go with Hagar's story, and let's just act like we don't know where any of the other religious stories of the world is going to go, and let's just read Genesis 16 as this story in the early pages of Torah, a story important enough that it's included. And included means there's something I can learn from it. And I want to try to shine a light tonight on Hagar's story. Not in a negative light, but I want to show that no matter your background, no matter what's going on in your world, He sees you. And Him seeing you is a great thing. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1, now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarah. Now I want to remind you a little history behind the words. When we are introduced to an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar, is a really clean English word to cover up something much, much darker. This is a young woman who's just past puberty, who is a slave from a foreign land of a different stripe and a different culture and a different race. She's been subjugated. This isn't a clean story. This isn't a pretty story. This isn't a highly moral story. Please understand this. If we coat these things over in the name of trying to make things look clean or make them palatable, we miss the guts in the story. We miss the pain. And if we miss the pain, we might miss the promise that comes in these chapters. So put the pain front and center. Slave girl, taken, subjugated, told who not just she's going to marry, that's out of the question, told who's going to sleep with her in this story. It doesn't get prettier or cleaner, by the way, as Genesis 16 progresses. Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, and Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. And I pause here to bring out, in the Hebrew, this goes a little deeper than Sarah became despised in the eyes of Hagar. Literally, the Hebrew vernacular says she saw her mistress from that day on as a dishonorable woman. And so literally the fact that Sarah had done nothing to protect Hagar in this incident, but rather had thrown Hagar into this incident, causes Hagar to turn on Sarah and see her as a dishonorable woman. And so Sarah then says to Abram in verse 5, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes," or now she sees me as dishonorable. "So the Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarah, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarah dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. And now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. We stop for a moment. There's more to read. This is not a long chapter. We're literally almost halfway through it. The story is nearly finished, but the part that we've read so far isn't pretty. Nothing has happened in a good light at this point in our story. We've had a pretty uncomfortable look at slavery and misogyny and rape and abuse. And now Hagar, having been physically abused as well as every other type, is going to be sent out into verse 7 says, into a wilderness.